What if God whispered a promise in your ear that wouldn't come true until everyone around you was dead? Two men heard the voice of destiny while standing in a land of giants, and the entire nation wanted to kill them for believing it. This is the prophecy of Joshua and Caleb, written in blood, tested in wilderness, and fulfilled in conquest. 12 spies, 10 said impossible, 2 said inevitable. The choice that day didn't just seal the fate of a generation, it revealed who would inherit eternity and who would become dust in the desert. God spoke a terrifying decree: every doubter will die, but these two will live to see my promise fulfilled. 40 years of funerals, 40 years watching prophecy slowly, methodically come true with every grave dug in the sand. And then, when the last doubter fell, the Jordan River split open like the Red Sea, and 2 old warriors, one 85, still strong enough to slaughter giants, walked into the land God had shown them decades before. Their footsteps had been prophesied. Their victory had been written. Their faith had outlived an empire of fear. This is their story. The journey from Egypt had been long and miraculous. The Israelites had seen the Red Sea split in 2, watched manna fall from heaven every morning, and heard the voice of God thunder from Mount Sinai. Now they stood at Kadesh Barnea, right at the doorway to everything God had promised their ancestor Abraham hundreds of years before. The land of Canaan was right there, waiting for them. God spoke directly to Moses with clear instructions. In Numbers chapter 13, verse 1 and 2, the Lord said to Moses, "Send some men to explore the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites. From each ancestral tribe, send one of its leaders." This wasn't a mission to decide whether they should enter the land. God had already told them it was theirs. This was a reconnaissance mission, a chance to see what they were walking into. Moses obeyed immediately. He chose 12 men, one from each tribe, and these weren't just random people from the camp. Numbers 13, verse 3 tells us, "So at the Lord's command, Moses sent them out from the desert of Paran." All of them were leaders of the Israelites. These were respected men, tribal heads who carried weight in their communities. Among the 12 names, 2 would become legendary. From the tribe of Ephraim came Hoshea, son of Nun, and Moses gave him a new name, Joshua, which means "the Lord saves." From the tribe of Judah came Caleb, son of Jephunneh. At this moment, they were just 2 names on a list. Nobody knew yet that these 2 would be different from all the others. Moses gave the 12 men their mission. He told them exactly what to look for, and his instructions in Numbers 13, verses 17 through 20 were specific. Go up through the Negev and on into the hill country. See what the land is like and whether the people who live there are strong or weak, few or many. What kind of land do they live in? Is it good or bad? What kind of towns do they live in? Are they unwalled or fortified? How is the soil? Is it fertile or poor? Are there trees in it or not? Do your best to bring back some of the fruit of the land. The 12 men set out together. They entered Canaan from the south and traveled all the way to the north, covering the entire length of the land. Numbers 13, verse 21 records their route. So they went up and explored the land from the desert of Zin as far as Rehob, toward Lebo Hamath. This was no quick trip around the corner. They walked through valleys, climbed hills, passed by fortified cities, and observed everything. The mission took exactly 40 days. During that time, they saw things that amazed them and things that frightened them. They walked through the hill country and came to a place called the Valley of Eshcol. What they found there made their eyes go wide. Numbers 13, verse 23, describes the moment when they reached the Valley of Eshcol. They cut off a branch bearing a single cluster of grapes. 2 of them carried it on a pole between them, along with some pomegranates and figs. Think about that for a second. One cluster of grapes so heavy it took 2 grown men to carry it on a pole. The soil in this land was incredibly rich. Everything Moses had told them about a land flowing with milk and honey was true. They could see it with their own eyes. They could taste it. But they also saw the people who lived there. They saw massive fortified cities with walls that seemed to touch the sky. They saw warriors who made them feel small. They observed the descendants of Anak, men of enormous size who had a fearsome reputation throughout the region. Every observation, every sight, every encounter was being stored in their minds, ready to be reported when they returned to camp. After 40 days, the 12 spies made their way back to Kadesh Barnea, where the entire community of Israel waited. The whole camp gathered to hear what they had discovered. Moses and Aaron stood there along with everyone else, eager for the report. The spies presented the evidence first. They showed the massive grapes, the pomegranates, and the figs. Then they began to speak, and at first, everything sounded wonderful. Numbers 13, verse 27 records their initial report. "We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit." You could almost hear the excitement rippling through the crowd. This was it. This was the land God had promised them. But then came the word that changed everything. One simple word, but. Numbers 13, verse 28 continues, "But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there." They kept going, listing all the different groups of people who lived in the land. The Amalekites lived in the Negev. The Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites lived in the hill country. The Canaanites lived along the coast and near the Jordan River. With each name, the fear grew thicker in the air. 10 of the 12 spies had made up their minds. What they had seen terrified them, and they wanted everyone else to feel that same terror. They painted a picture of impossibility, of certain defeat, of suicide if they dared to go forward. The crowd started to murmur. You could feel the fear spreading like a disease through the camp. People began to panic, to question, to doubt, and that's when one voice cut through all the noise. Caleb stepped forward. He had heard enough. Numbers 13, verse 30 captures the moment. Then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, "We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it." His voice was strong, confident, certain. He wasn't denying what they had seen. He wasn't pretending the cities weren't fortified or that the people weren't powerful. He had seen exactly what the other spies had seen. He had walked the same paths, observed the same cities, encountered the same giants. But Caleb saw something else too. He saw the promise of God, and that promise was bigger than any wall, stronger than any giant, more certain than any obstacle. We can certainly do it. 5 words that separated faith from fear. 5 words that showed what Caleb was made of. He wasn't speaking from arrogance or foolish optimism. He was speaking from a deep trust in the God who had brought them out of Egypt, who had parted the Red Sea, who had defeated Pharaoh's army, who had promised them this land. But the 10 other spies weren't having it. They counted immediately, and their response is recorded in Numbers 13, verses 31 through 33. But the men who had gone up with him said, "We can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are." And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, "The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them, grasshoppers." That's how they saw themselves. Not as the people of the living God, not as the nation that had witnessed miracle after miracle, but as insects compared to the inhabitants of Canaan. And the problem wasn't just how the giants saw them, it was how they saw themselves. The bad report spread through the camp like wildfire. What started as murmuring became loud complaints, and what started as complaints became open rebellion. That night was one of the darkest in Israel's history. Numbers 14 opens with the scene. That night, all the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud, an entire nation crying in despair. Men, women, children, everyone was gripped by fear and hopelessness. The sound of weeping filled the camp under the desert stars. But the crying didn't last long before it turned into something worse. Numbers 14, verses 2 and 3 show us how quickly things spiraled. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, "If only we had died in Egypt, or in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land, only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt?" Read that again. They wished they had died in Egypt, the place where they had been slaves, where their baby boys had been thrown into the Nile, where they had been beaten and forced to make bricks without straw. They wished they had died in the wilderness instead of entering the land God had promised them. They actually believed God had brought them all this way just to destroy them. The rebellion went even deeper. Numbers 14 verse 4 records their plan. "And they said to each other, 'We should choose a leader and go back to Egypt.'" They were ready to elect a new leader, to reject Moses and Aaron completely, to turn their backs on everything God had done for them and march straight back into slavery. This wasn't just fear talking. This was complete rejection of God's promise, God's power, and God's plan. After everything they had witnessed, after all the miracles, they were ready to throw it all away because of a bad report from 10 frightened men. Moses and Aaron were so overwhelmed by what was happening that they fell face down in front of the entire assembly. They had no words, but Joshua and Caleb did. The two faithful spies did something dramatic. Numbers 14 verse 6 tells us, "Joshua son of Nun and Caleb son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had explored the land, tore their clothes." This was a sign of deep anguish and distress. They weren't just upset. They were heartbroken that their people were about to make the worst decision of their lives. Then they addressed the whole community. Their words in Numbers 14, verses 7 through 9, ring with passion and truth. "The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them." Listen to what they were saying. The land wasn't just good, it was exceedingly good. Everything depended on God's pleasure, not on their military strength. The inhabitants of Canaan might look powerful, but their protection was gone. The real question wasn't whether the Canaanites were strong. The real question was whether God was with Israel, and he was. Joshua and Caleb flipped the script completely. The other spies said the land devours its inhabitants. Joshua and Caleb said, "We will devour them." The other spies saw themselves as grasshoppers. Joshua and Caleb saw the enemy as bread to be eaten. Same land, same obstacles, completely different perspective. They begged the people not to rebel against the Lord. They pleaded with them not to be afraid. They reminded them of the one fact that mattered most: the Lord is with us. But their words, as true and powerful as they were, fell on deaf ears. The response to Joshua and Caleb's plea was terrifying. These two men had just given the people the truth. They had encouraged them, reminded them of God's presence, urged them to trust and move forward. And how did the assembly respond? Numbers 14 verse 10 gives us the chilling answer. "But the whole assembly talked about stoning them," not just rejecting their words, not just ignoring them. The people wanted to kill them. They wanted to pick up rocks and stone Joshua and Caleb to death for telling them to trust God. Think about that moment. Two men standing before thousands, maybe millions, of angry people who are ready to execute them. Their crime, believing God's promise. Their offense, having faith when everyone else chose fear. They were about to be murdered for telling the truth. This is what happens when an entire community gives itself over to fear and rebellion. Logic disappears, gratitude vanishes. People turn violent against the very ones trying to save them. Joshua and Caleb stood there, knowing that at any second the first stone could fly through the air. But just as the crowd was ready to act, something stopped them in their tracks. The same verse continues. Then the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting to all the Israelites. God himself intervened. His glory, visible, unmistakable, powerful, appeared right there in front of everyone. The rocks dropped from their hands. The shouting stopped. Suddenly they weren't dealing with just Moses, Aaron, Joshua, and Caleb anymore. They were standing before the living God, and he had something to say. God spoke to Moses, and his words were heavy with anger and disappointment. Numbers 14, verses 11 and 12, reveal his heart. The Lord said to Moses, "How long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me, in spite of all the signs I have performed among them? I will strike them down with a plague and destroy them, but I will make you into a nation greater and stronger than they." God was ready to wipe them out and start over with Moses. He had every right to. They had seen the plagues in Egypt, the parted Red Sea, the pillar of cloud and fire, the manna from heaven, water from a rock, his presence on Mount Sinai. And still they refused to believe him. Still they treated him with contempt. But Moses interceded. He pleaded with God, reminding him of his reputation among the nations, his character, his promise. And God listened. Numbers 14 verses 20 and 21 record God's response. The Lord replied, "I have forgiven them, as you asked. Nevertheless, as surely as I live, and as surely as the glory of the Lord fills the whole earth," God forgave them. He didn't destroy the entire nation. But forgiveness doesn't mean there are no consequences. God's judgment came next, and it was specific and severe. Numbers 14 verses 22 and 23 lay out the sentence. "Not one of those who saw my glory and the signs I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, but who disobeyed me and tested me 10 times, not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their ancestors. No one who has treated me with contempt will ever see it." Every person 20 years old or older who had grumbled against God would die in the wilderness. They would never set foot in the promised land. They would wander in the desert until the last one of them had fallen. But then God made an exception. Numbers 14, verse 24 singles out one man. "But because my servant Caleb has a different spirit and follows me wholeheartedly, I will bring him into the land he went to, and his descendants will inherit it." Caleb had a different spirit. While everyone else saw obstacles, he saw opportunities. While everyone else saw giants, he saw God. While everyone else chose fear, he chose faith. And God noticed. God honored it. God promised that Caleb would enter the land. And though it's not mentioned in this exact moment, Joshua too was spared from the judgment. These 2 men, the only 2 of the 12 spies who believed God, would be the only ones of their generation to cross into Canaan. The people were sentenced to 40 years in the wilderness, 1 year for each day the spies had explored the land. Numbers 14 verse 34 makes it clear. For 40 years, 1 year for each of the 40 days you explored the land, you will suffer for your sins and know what it is like to have me against you. As for the 10 spies who spread the bad report, they didn't even make it through the night. Numbers 14 verse 37 records their fate. These men who were responsible for spreading the bad report about the land were struck down and died of a plague before the Lord. The judgment was set. The sentence was final. An entire generation would perish in the wilderness because they chose to believe 10 frightened men instead of the God who had never failed them. Only Joshua and Caleb would live to see the promise fulfilled. The 10 spies who had spread fear throughout the camp didn't live to see another sunrise. God's judgment came swiftly and decisively. Numbers 14, verse 36 and 37 record what happened. So the men Moses had sent to explore the land, who returned and made the whole community grumble against him by spreading a bad report about it. These men who were responsible for spreading the bad report about the land were struck down and died of a plague before the Lord. Just like that, they were gone. The same men who had stood before the assembly the day before, convincing everyone that entering Canaan was impossible, now lay dead. But Joshua and Caleb, Numbers 14 verse 38 makes their fate clear. Of the men who went to explore the land, only Joshua son of Nun and Caleb son of Jephunneh survived. When Moses told the people about God's judgment, that they would wander for 40 years until every adult among them had died in the wilderness, the camp was filled with mourning. Numbers 14 verse 39 says, "When Moses reported this to all the Israelites, they mourned bitterly. The reality of what they had done crashed down on them like a heavy weight. They had thrown away their future because of fear." The sentence was clear and mathematical. Numbers 14 verses 33 and 34 laid it out. "Your children will be shepherds here for 40 years, suffering for your unfaithfulness, until the last of your bodies lies in the wilderness. For 40 years, 1 year for each of the 40 days you explored the land, you will suffer for your sins and know what it is like to have me against you." 40 days of exploration had cost them 40 years of wandering. An entire generation would never see the land their parents had left Egypt to claim. The children who they feared would be taken as plunder would be the ones to inherit the promise instead. The people's response to God's judgment was as foolish as their initial rebellion. After spending all night wishing they could go back to Egypt, after refusing to enter Canaan when God commanded them to, they suddenly decided they wanted to go after all. But now it was too late. Numbers 14 verse 40 describes what happened the next morning. Early the next morning, they set out for the highest point in the hill country, saying, "Now we are ready to go up to the land the Lord promised. Surely we have sinned." They acknowledged their sin, but they didn't understand repentance. Real repentance means accepting the consequences and submitting to God's will. They wanted to fix everything on their own terms. Moses warned them clearly. His words in Numbers 14, verses 41 through 43, were direct and urgent. But Moses said, "Why are you disobeying the Lord's command? This will not succeed. Do not go up, because the Lord is not with you. You will be defeated by your enemies, for the Amalekites and the Canaanites will face you there. Because you have turned away from the Lord, he will not be with you, and you will fall by the sword." The warning couldn't have been clearer. God was not with them anymore for this mission. Going up to fight now would be suicide. But they didn't listen. Numbers 14, verse 44 tells us what they did. "Nevertheless, in their presumption, they went up toward the highest point in the hill country, though neither Moses nor the Ark of the Lord's covenant moved from the camp." Notice that Moses stayed in the camp. The Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of God's presence, stayed in the camp. The people went alone, powered by their own strength and determination, not by God's command or blessing. The result was exactly what Moses predicted. Numbers 14 verse 45 records the disaster. "Then the Amalekites and the Canaanites who lived in that hill country came down and attacked them and beat them down all the way to Hormah. It was a complete defeat, a crushing blow that proved what should have been obvious. Without God, they were nothing. In one day, the people had shown both sides of disobedience. First, they refused to go when God said go. Then they insisted on going when God said stop. Both were rebellion. Both ended in death. While the nation began its long journey through the wilderness, Joshua's role became increasingly clear. He wasn't just another Israelite waiting out the 40 years. He was being prepared for leadership, shaped and trained under the greatest leader Israel would ever know. Joshua had been Moses' aide from early on. Back in Exodus 24, when Moses went up Mount Sinai to meet with God and receive the law, Joshua went partway up the mountain with him. Exodus 24 verse 13 mentions this. "Then Moses set out with Joshua his aide, and Moses went up on the mountain of God. While the elders stayed below and Moses went to the summit, Joshua waited somewhere in between, closer to the presence of God than anyone except Moses himself. When Moses came down from the mountain after 40 days and nights, carrying the tablets of the law, Joshua was right there. Exodus 32 verses 17 and 18 show us Joshua's devotion. When Joshua heard the noise of the people shouting, he said to Moses, "There is the sound of war in the camp." Moses replied, "It is not the sound of victory, it is not the sound of defeat, it is the sound of singing that I hear." Joshua had stayed faithful in his post, waiting for Moses while the people below built a golden calf. But perhaps the most telling detail about Joshua appears in Exodus 33. After the golden calf incident, Moses set up a tent of meeting outside the camp where he would go to speak with the Lord. Exodus 33 verse 11 gives us a remarkable insight. The Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend. Then Moses would return to the camp, but his young aide Joshua son of Nun did not leave the tent. Everyone else came and went. Moses himself would return to the camp after meeting with God. But Joshua stayed. He lingered in the presence of God. He didn't want to leave. This wasn't just duty or service. This was hunger for God, a desire to be near him that went beyond what was required. Through all those wilderness years, Joshua learned from Moses. He watched how Moses led, how he interceded, how he handled conflict, how he sought God's face. Every lesson, every experience, every crisis was preparing Joshua for the day when he would have to lead alone. While Joshua remained close to Moses in the center of Israel's leadership, Caleb's story during the wilderness years is quieter. The Bible doesn't give us many details about what Caleb did during those 40 years, but his silence speaks volumes. Caleb went back to his tribe. He lived among the people who were under the same judgment as everyone else, watching the years pass by, watching his generation slowly die off. He had been 40 years old when Moses sent him to spy out the land. Now he would have to wait until he was 85 to see God's promise fulfilled. Think about what that required. Caleb had stood before the entire nation and declared, "We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it." He had been ready. He had been willing. He had faith. And then God said, "Not yet. You have to wait 40 years because of everyone else's unbelief." That could have made Caleb bitter. He could have spent those decades complaining, reminding everyone that he had been right, that they should have listened to him. He could have become angry at God for making him suffer the consequences of other people's sin. But we don't see any record of that. What we do see, much later in the story, is Caleb's own testimony about these years. In Joshua 14 verse 10, when Caleb finally claimed his inheritance, he said something important. "Now then, just as the Lord promised, he has kept me alive for 45 years since the time he said this to Moses, while Israel moved about in the wilderness. So here I am today, 85 years old." The Lord kept him alive. Through all those years of wandering, through all the deaths, through all the waiting, God preserved Caleb. That was enough for him. He didn't need constant recognition or validation. He had God's promise, and he held on to it in silence and strength. Caleb's faithfulness wasn't loud or showy during these years. It was steady, patient, enduring. He believed God would keep his word, and he was willing to wait as long as it took. The 40 years of wandering were marked by one constant reality: death. Everyone who had been 20 years old or older at Kadesh Barnea, everyone who had grumbled against God and refused to enter the promised land, would die before the journey ended. Only Joshua and Caleb were exempt. The Israelites moved from place to place throughout those years. They camped at different locations, faced various challenges, and watched as funeral after funeral took place. Numbers 33 lists many of the places they traveled during the wilderness period: Kadesh, Mount Hor, and numerous other stops as they wandered through the desert. Even Moses' own family wasn't spared from the judgment. Aaron, the high priest and Moses' brother, died on Mount Hor. Numbers 20, verses 25 through 28 describe what happened. Get Aaron and his son Eleazar and take them up Mount Hor. Remove Aaron's garments and put them on his son Eleazar, for Aaron will be gathered to his people, he will die there. Moses did as the Lord commanded. They went up Mount Hor in the sight of the whole community. Moses removed Aaron's priestly garments and put them on his son Eleazar, and Aaron died there on top of the mountain. Aaron had been 83 years old when he and Moses first confronted Pharaoh. He had witnessed every plague, walked through the Red Sea, seen God's glory on Mount Sinai. But he too had failed at Kadesh when he stood with Moses and didn't honor God as holy before the people. He died in the wilderness, never entering the promised land. Miriam, Moses' sister, who had watched over baby Moses in the Nile and led the women in song after crossing the Red Sea, also died during the wilderness wandering. Numbers 20, verse 1 simply states, "In the first month, the whole Israelite community arrived at the desert of Zin, and they stayed at Kadesh. There Miriam died and was buried." Year after year, the older generation passed away. Children grew into adults who had never known Egypt, who had been born in freedom, who had learned to trust God in the wilderness. The camp was constantly changing as the condemned generation diminished and a new generation rose to take their place. By the time the 40 years were complete, only 2 men remained from those who had left Egypt as adults, Joshua and Caleb. They had outlived everyone. They had watched an entire generation die because of unbelief. They stood as living proof that faith is rewarded and that God keeps his promises, both his warnings and his blessings. Before the incident at Kadesh Barnea, before the spies were sent into Canaan, Joshua had already proven himself as a military commander. This happened earlier in the journey at a place called Rephidim, and it was Joshua's first major test in battle. The Israelites had been complaining about the lack of water, and God had provided by having Moses strike a rock. But then a new threat emerged. Exodus 17 verse 8 introduces the conflict. The Amalekites came and attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. Moses immediately turned to Joshua. This is the first time we see Joshua's name mentioned in Scripture, and Moses already trusted him enough to put him in charge of the entire fighting force. Exodus 17 verse 9 records Moses' command. Moses said to Joshua, "Choose some of our men and go out to fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands." Joshua obeyed without question. He selected men, organized them, and led them into battle, while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the hill to watch. What happened next was extraordinary and showed Joshua something crucial about victory. Exodus 17, verses 11 and 12, describe the strange connection between Moses on the hill and Joshua in the valley. As long as Moses held up his hands, the Israelites were winning. But whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites were winning. When Moses' hands grew tired, they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. Aaron and Hur held his hands up, one on one side, one on the other, so that his hands remained steady till sunset. Joshua was down in the valley, sword in hand, leading the troops, fighting with everything he had. But the real battle was being won on the hilltop through Moses' intercession. When Moses' hands were lifted with the staff of God, Israel prevailed. When they dropped, the enemy gained ground. Aaron and Hur had to support Moses' arms until the sun went down. The outcome is recorded in Exodus 17, verse 13. So Joshua overcame the Amalekite army with the sword. Joshua won the battle, but he learned an invaluable lesson. Military skill and courage matter, but victory ultimately comes from God. A commander's strength in battle must be connected to dependence on the Lord. After the victory, God gave Moses a specific instruction in Exodus 17, verse 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Write this on a scroll as something to be remembered and make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven." God wanted Joshua to know that this enemy would eventually be destroyed completely. It was a promise that would take generations to fulfill, but Joshua needed to hear it and remember it. This battle at Rephidim was more than just a military victory. It was Joshua's introduction to leadership, his first taste of commanding troops, and his first lesson in the relationship between human effort and divine intervention. As the 40 years drew to a close, the time came for a transition. Moses himself would not enter the promised land. He had failed to honor God as holy at the waters of Meribah when he struck the rock in anger instead of speaking to it as God commanded. Because of this, God told Moses he would see the land from a distance but never walk on its soil. Moses needed a successor, and God had already chosen who it would be. Numbers 27, verses 15 through 17 show us Moses' concern for the people and his request to God. Moses said to the Lord, "May the Lord, the God who gives breath to all living things, appoint someone over this community to go out and come in before them, one who will lead them out and bring them in, so the Lord's people will not be like sheep without a shepherd." God's response was immediate and clear. Numbers 27 verse 18 says, "So the Lord said to Moses, 'Take Joshua son of Nun, a man in whom is the spirit of leadership, and lay your hand on him.'" God didn't say Joshua had potential or that he might work out. God confirmed that the Spirit was already in Joshua. He was ready. Moses followed God's instructions exactly. Numbers 27 verses 19 through 21 describe the public ceremony. "Have him stand before Eleazar the priest and the entire assembly and commission him in their presence. Give him some of your authority, so the whole Israelite community will obey him. He is to stand before Eleazar the priest, who will obtain decisions for him by inquiring of the Urim before the Lord. At his command, he and the entire community of the Israelites will go out, and at his command they will come in." This wasn't a private moment. This was a public transfer of leadership done before the whole community. Moses laid his hands on Joshua, passing on authority, and Eleazar the priest stood there representing God's guidance for the future. Everyone could see that Joshua was now the leader who would take them forward. Later, in Deuteronomy, as Moses prepared for his death, he spoke directly to Joshua in front of all Israel. Deuteronomy 31, verses 7 and 8, record Moses' charge. "Then Moses summoned Joshua and said to him in the presence of all Israel, 'Be strong and courageous, for you must go with this people into the land that the Lord swore to their ancestors to give them, and you must divide it among them as their inheritance. The Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. Be strong and courageous.'" These words would echo in Joshua's ears for the rest of his life. Moses said them publicly so everyone would know that Joshua had been chosen and blessed. The commission was complete. Joshua was no longer just Moses' aide. He was the leader of Israel. The 40 years were over. The wilderness generation had died just as God said they would. A new generation stood ready, and they had traveled to the plains of Moab, right across the Jordan River from Jericho. The promised land was right there in front of them, so close they could see it. Moses gathered the people for his final words. The book of Deuteronomy records his farewell speeches, where he reminded them of everything God had done, reviewed the law, and warned them to stay faithful. He knew his time was ending. Deuteronomy 31 verse 14 describes God's summons to Moses. The Lord said to Moses, "Now the day of your death is near. Call Joshua and present yourselves at the tent of meeting where I will commission him. So Moses and Joshua came and presented themselves at the tent of meeting. God spoke to Joshua directly, confirming what Moses had already told him. Deuteronomy 31 verse 23 records God's words. The Lord gave this command to Joshua, son of Nun. Be strong and courageous, for you will bring the Israelites into the land I promised them on oath, and I myself will be with you. Then Moses did something remarkable. He climbed Mount Nebo across from Jericho, and God showed him the entire promised land. Deuteronomy 34 verses 1 through 4 describe the moment. Then Moses climbed Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab to the top of Pisgah across from Jericho. There the Lord showed him the whole land, from Gilead to Dan, all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the Mediterranean Sea, the Negev and the whole region from the valley of Jericho, the city of palms, as far as Zoar. Then the Lord said to him, This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, when I said, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it. Moses saw it all, every corner of the land, but he couldn't enter, and there on Mount Nebo Moses died. Deuteronomy 34 verses 5 through 7 record his passing. And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite Beth Peor, but to this day no one knows where his grave is. Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak, nor his strength gone. The people mourned for Moses for 30 days, and then the mourning ended, and reality set in. Joshua was now in charge. Deuteronomy 34 verse 9 confirms it. Now Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. So the Israelites listened to him and did what the Lord had commanded Moses. The Israelites stood at the edge of the Jordan River. Behind them were 40 years of wandering, a generation buried in the wilderness, and the memory of Moses. Ahead of them was the Promised Land, filled with fortified cities and powerful enemies, and leading them was Joshua, with Caleb somewhere among the tribes, both of them the last survivors of those who had left Egypt as adults. The promise was about to be fulfilled. Joshua now stood as the leader of Israel, and God wasted no time giving him instructions. The Jordan River was at flood stage, swollen and dangerous, flowing between the Israelites and the land God had promised them. But God had a plan that would remind everyone of what he had done at the Red Sea 40 years earlier. Joshua 1 verses 1 and 2 record God's first words to the new leader. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people, get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I am about to give to them, to the Israelites. God repeated his promise to Joshua personally. Joshua 1 verses 5 and 6 contain words that would sustain Joshua through every battle ahead. No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give them. Joshua immediately took action. He commanded the officers to tell the people to prepare provisions, because in 3 days they would cross the Jordan and take possession of the land. Then he sent 2 spies secretly to scout out Jericho, learning from the past, but this time keeping the mission quiet. When the spies returned with good news that the people of the land were terrified of Israel, Joshua prepared for the crossing. Joshua 3 verses 14 and 15 describe the moment. So when the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant went ahead of them. Now the Jordan is at flood stage all during harvest. Yet as soon as the priests who carried the Ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, what happened next was a miracle that marked the beginning of the conquest. Joshua 3 verse 16 continues, the water from upstream stopped flowing. It piled up in a heap a great distance away, at a town called Adam, in the vicinity of Zarethan, while the water flowing down to the Sea of the Arabah, that is, the Dead Sea, was completely cut off. So the people crossed over opposite Jericho. The entire nation crossed on dry ground, while the priests holding the ark stood firm in the middle of the riverbed. When everyone had crossed, Joshua commanded one man from each tribe to take a stone from the middle of the Jordan, where the priests had stood. These 12 stones were set up at Gilgal as a memorial. Joshua 4, verses 21 through 24, explains the purpose. He said to the Israelites, "In the future, when your descendants ask their parents, 'What do these stones mean?' tell them, 'Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground.' For the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you until you had crossed over. The Lord your God did to the Jordan what he had done to the Red Sea when he dried it up before us until we had crossed over. He did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God." The crossing was complete. Israel was finally in the Promised Land. The first obstacle in Canaan was Jericho, a heavily fortified city with massive walls. Joshua 6, verse 1 describes the situation. Now the gates of Jericho were securely barred because of the Israelites. No one went out and no one came in. The city was locked down tight, prepared for a siege, but God had a battle plan that made no military sense at all. He appeared to Joshua as the commander of the army of the Lord and gave him specific instructions. The Israelites weren't going to build siege equipment or scale the walls. They were going to march around the city. Joshua 6, verses 3 and 4 lay out God's unusual strategy. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. Joshua gathered the priests and the fighting men and told them exactly what to do. For 6 days, they marched around Jericho once each day in complete silence, except for the sound of the trumpets. The armed guard went ahead, then came the 7 priests, blowing their ram's horns, then the Ark of the Covenant, then the rear guard. They circled the city, returned to camp, and repeated the process the next day. Can you imagine what the people inside Jericho were thinking? They watched this strange procession day after day, probably confused and maybe even more frightened because it was so bizarre. The Israelites didn't attack, didn't shout threats, didn't do anything except walk around their city in silence. On the 7th day, everything changed. Joshua 6, verse 15 tells us, "On the 7th day, they got up at daybreak and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner, except that on that day, they circled the city 7 times. 7 times they went around that day, and on the 7th lap, something different happened." Joshua 6, verses 16 and 17 describe the climactic moment. The 7th time around, when the priests sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the army, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord." The people shouted, the priests blew their trumpets, and the impossible happened. Joshua 6, verse 20 records it. When the trumpet sounded, the army shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So everyone charged straight in, and they took the city. The walls of Jericho fell flat. Not partially, not in one section. The entire wall system collapsed, and the Israelites rushed in from every side. They captured the city and devoted it to the Lord, as he had commanded. Only Rahab, the prostitute, and her family were spared because she had hidden the 2 spies and helped them escape. Jericho's fall sent a message throughout Canaan. The God of Israel fought for his people, and no wall was thick enough to stop him. After Jericho came a setback at Ai because of Achan's sin. He had taken devoted things from Jericho that were supposed to be destroyed. Once the sin was dealt with, Joshua attacked Ai again, this time successfully using an ambush strategy that God approved. Word of Israel's victories spread terror throughout Canaan. The kings of the region began forming alliances to fight against Israel, but one group took a different approach. The Gibeonites. They tricked Joshua into making a peace treaty with them by pretending to be from a distant country. When Joshua discovered the deception, he honored the treaty, but made the Gibeonites woodcutters and water carriers for Israel. This treaty triggered a major conflict. 5 Amorite kings, the kings of Jerusalem, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon, formed a coalition and attacked Gibeon for making peace with Israel. The Gibeonites sent an urgent message to Joshua asking for help. Joshua responded immediately. Joshua 10 verses 6 and 7 describe his quick action. The Gibeonites then sent word to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal. "Do not abandon your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us. Help us, because all the Amorite kings from the hill country have joined forces against us." So Joshua marched up from Gilgal with his entire army, including all the best fighting men. God encouraged Joshua before the battle. Joshua 10 verse 8 records God's promise. The Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid of them. I have given them into your hand. Not one of them will be able to withstand you." Joshua marched all night and launched a surprise attack at dawn. What happened next was extraordinary. Joshua 10 verses 10 and 11 describe the battle. The Lord threw them into confusion before Israel, so Joshua and the Israelites defeated them completely at Gibeon. Israel pursued them along the road going up to Beth Horon and cut them down all the way to Azekah and Makkedah. As they fled before Israel on the road down from Beth Horon to Azekah, the Lord hurled large hailstones down on them, and more of them died from the hail than were killed by the swords of the Israelites. God himself fought for Israel that day, throwing hailstones from heaven that killed more enemies than Israel's swords did. But Joshua needed more time to complete the victory. The day was ending, and the enemy forces were still fleeing. So Joshua did something that has amazed people ever since. Joshua 10 verses 12 and 13 record his bold prayer and what happened. On the day the Lord gave the Amorites over to Israel, Joshua said to the Lord in the presence of Israel, "Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and you, moon, over the valley of Aijalon." So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped till the nation avenged itself on its enemies, as it is written in the book of Jashar. The sun stopped in the middle of the sky and delayed going down about a full day. God answered Joshua's prayer and extended the day so Israel could finish the battle. The 5 kings tried to hide in a cave at Makkedah, but Joshua had them trapped there until after the battle, then brought them out and executed them. This southern campaign didn't stop with one battle. Joshua 10 verses 40 through 42 summarize the conquest of the south. So Joshua subdued the whole region, including the hill country, the Negev, the western foothills and the mountain slopes, together with all their kings. He left no survivors. He totally destroyed all who breathed, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. Joshua subdued them from Kadesh Barnea to Gaza and from the whole region of Goshen to Gibeon. All these kings and their lands Joshua conquered in one campaign, because the Lord, the God of Israel, fought for Israel. Then Joshua turned his attention to the north. The king of Hazor heard about Israel's victories and assembled a massive coalition. Joshua 11 verse 4 describes the size of this northern army. They came out with all their troops and a large number of horses and chariots, a huge army, as numerous as the sand on the seashore. God told Joshua not to be afraid, and once again Joshua attacked suddenly. Joshua 11 verses 7 and 8 record the victory. So Joshua and his whole army came against them suddenly at the waters of Merom and attacked them, and the Lord gave them into the hand of Israel. They defeated them and pursued them all the way to Greater Sidon, to Misrephoth-Maim, and to the valley of Mizpah on the east, until no survivors were left. Joshua captured Hazor and burned it to the ground. The conquest continued until the major resistance in Canaan was broken. After years of warfare, Joshua had aged considerably. The major battles were won, the power of the Canaanite kings was broken, but the conquest wasn't entirely finished. Large areas still needed to be taken, and it was time to shift strategy. Joshua 13 verse 1 marks this transition. When Joshua had grown old, the Lord said to him, "You are very old, and there are still very large areas of land to be taken over." God listed the regions that remained unconquered, the territory of the Philistines, the land of the Geshurites, areas in Lebanon, and various other pockets of resistance. But instead of waiting until every last enemy was defeated, God told Joshua to proceed with dividing the land among the tribes. Each tribe would receive their inheritance and would be responsible for driving out the remaining inhabitants from their assigned territory. Joshua 13 verse 7 contains God's instruction, "And divide it as an inheritance among the 9 tribes and half of the tribe of Manasseh." The division of the land was a massive undertaking. Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh had already received their inheritance on the east side of the Jordan before Moses died. Now, the remaining 9.5 tribes needed their portions. Joshua 14 verse 1 describes the process. "Now these are the areas the Israelites received as an inheritance in the land of Canaan, which Eleazar the priest, Joshua son of Nun, and the heads of the tribal clans of Israel allotted to them." The distribution was done by casting lots before the Lord, ensuring that God determined each tribe's location, not human preference or politics. Some territories were given based on size and population. Joshua 17, verses 14 through 18, record a conversation with the tribes of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh, who complained that their allotment was too small. Joshua told them to clear the forested hill country if they needed more space, and to drive out the Canaanites who had iron chariots, even though it would be difficult. The tent of meeting was set up at Shiloh, making it the central place of worship. 7 tribes still hadn't received their inheritance, and Joshua challenged them in Joshua 18 verse 3. "How long will you wait before you begin to take possession of the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has given you?" He sent men to survey the remaining land and divide it into 7 parts. Then cast lots at Shiloh to determine which tribe got which section. The land distribution was systematic and fair, overseen by Joshua and Eleazar with the tribal leaders' help. 6 cities of refuge were designated, 3 on each side of the Jordan, where someone who accidentally killed another person could flee for protection. The Levites received towns scattered throughout all the tribal territories, since they had no land inheritance of their own, just as Moses had commanded. During the distribution of the land, something remarkable happened. An old man stepped forward to claim a promise that had been made to him 45 years earlier. Caleb, now 85 years old, came to Joshua at Gilgal. Joshua 14, verse 6 introduces the moment. "Now the people of Judah approached Joshua at Gilgal, and Caleb son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite said to him, 'You know what the Lord said to Moses the man of God at Kadesh Barnea about you and me.'" Caleb was reminding Joshua of their shared history, of the day when they stood together against an entire nation's fear. Caleb recounted his story. Joshua 14 verses 7 and 8 record his words. "I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land, and I brought him back a report according to my convictions. But my fellow Israelites who went up with me made the hearts of the people melt in fear. I, however, followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly." He reminded Joshua of Moses' promise. Joshua 14 verse 9 quotes what Moses had sworn. "So on that day Moses swore to me, 'The land on which your feet have walked will be your inheritance and that of your children forever, because you have followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly.'" Then Caleb testified to God's faithfulness over the decades. Joshua 14, verses 10 and 11 contain his powerful declaration, "Now then, just as the Lord promised, he has kept me alive for 45 years, since the time he said this to Moses, while Israel moved about in the wilderness. So here I am today, 85 years old. I'm still as strong today as the day Moses sent me out. I'm just as vigorous to go out to battle now as I was then." 85 years old and still strong. Caleb hadn't weakened or given up. He had waited patiently, watched everyone else die in the wilderness, and now stood ready to claim what God had promised him. But he wasn't asking for easy land or a comfortable retirement spot. Joshua 14 verse 12 reveals what Caleb wanted. "Now give me this hill country that the Lord promised me that day. You yourself heard then that the Anakites were there, and their cities were large and fortified, but the Lord helping me, I will drive them out just as he said." Caleb was asking for Hebron, the very place where the giant Anakites lived, the descendants of Anak who had terrified the 10 spies 45 years earlier. While those 10 spies had said the Anakites made them feel like grasshoppers, Caleb had said, "We can certainly take the land." Now, at 85, he was ready to prove it. Joshua responded to Caleb's request with blessing and approval. Joshua 14 verse 13 says, "Then Joshua blessed Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and gave him Hebron as his inheritance." The city that had symbolized impossibility and fear now became Caleb's reward for faith. But Caleb didn't just receive Hebron as a gift to sit back and enjoy. He had to fight for it, and he did. Joshua 15 verse 14 records what happened. From Hebron, Caleb drove out the 3 Anakites, Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, the sons of Anak. These were the very giants that had terrified the spies decades earlier. The Bible had specifically mentioned the descendants of Anak in the original spy report as the reason the land couldn't be taken. Now an 85-year-old man drove them out. Caleb's strength hadn't diminished, and his faith had only grown stronger through the years of waiting. Caleb continued his conquest beyond just Hebron. Joshua 15 verse 15 tells us, "From there he marched against the people living in Debir, formerly called Kiriath Sepher. He didn't stop with one victory. He kept pressing forward." Caleb made an interesting challenge regarding Debir. Joshua 15 verses 16 and 17 describe it. "And Caleb said, I will give my daughter Achsah in marriage to the man who attacks and captures Kiriath Sepher." Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's brother, took it, so Caleb gave his daughter Achsah to him in marriage. Even in his old age, Caleb was training the next generation of warriors. His nephew Othniel rose to the challenge and won both the city and Caleb's daughter. This same Othniel would later become the first judge of Israel after Joshua's death. The explanation for why Hebron became Caleb's inheritance is given in Joshua 14 verse 14. "So Hebron has belonged to Caleb son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, ever since, because he followed the Lord, the God of Israel, wholeheartedly. It wasn't just about a promise kept. It was about a man whose wholehearted devotion to God never wavered through 45 years of waiting." Joshua 14 verse 15 adds a final note. Hebron used to be called Kiriath Arba after Arba, who was the greatest man among the Anakites. Then the land had rest from war. The place named after the greatest of the giants now belonged to the man who trusted the greatest God. The process of dividing the land continued until every tribe had received its portion. Judah received a large territory in the south. Ephraim and Manasseh, the 2 sons of Joseph, each received significant areas in the central region. Benjamin's small but strategic territory lay between Judah and Ephraim. The northern tribes, Zebulun, Issachar, Asher, and Naphtali, received their inheritances in Galilee and the surrounding regions. Dan received territory in the west, though they later struggled to hold it and eventually migrated north to conquer another area. Simeon's inheritance was within Judah's territory, since Judah's portion was too large for them alone. The Levites, as mentioned earlier, received no territorial inheritance. Instead, they were given 48 towns scattered throughout all the other tribes' lands. Joshua 21, verses 41 and 42 summarize their allotment. The towns of the Levites in the territory held by the Israelites were 48 in all, together with their pasture lands. Each of these towns had pasture lands surrounding it. This was true for all these towns. When the entire distribution was complete, the Israelites gave Joshua his own inheritance. Joshua 19, verse 49 and 50 record this. When they had finished dividing the land into its allotted portions, the Israelites gave Joshua, son of Nun, an inheritance among them, as the Lord had commanded. They gave him the town he asked for, Timnath-Serah, in the hill country of Ephraim, and he built up the town and settled there. Joshua had led them across the Jordan, directed the conquest, overseen the distribution of the land to everyone else, and only at the very end did he receive his own town. He rebuilt Timnath-Serah and made it his home. Joshua 21, verses 43 through 45 provide a summary statement about the entire conquest and settlement. So the Lord gave Israel all the land he had sworn to give their ancestors, and they took possession of it and settled there. The Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their ancestors. Not one of their enemies withstood them. The Lord gave all their enemies into their hands. Not one of all the Lord's good promises to the people of Israel failed. Every one was fulfilled. Every promise God made came true. The land that seemed impossible to conquer was now Israel's inheritance. The giants that appeared unconquerable were defeated. The walls that looked impenetrable had fallen. Everything God said would happen had happened. Joshua knew his life was coming to an end. He had lived to see the promise fulfilled, had led Israel into their inheritance, and now it was time to prepare them for life without him. He gathered all Israel, their elders, leaders, judges, and officials, for a final address. Joshua 23 verse 2 sets the scene. Then Joshua summoned all Israel, their elders, leaders, judges, and officials, and said to them, I am very old. He didn't waste words. He reminded them of everything the Lord had done, how God had fought for them and given them the land. Joshua 23 verses 6 through 8 contain his charge to them. Be very strong, be careful to obey all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, without turning aside to the right or to the left. Do not associate with these nations that remain among you. Do not invoke the names of their gods or swear by them. You must not serve them or bow down to them. But you are to hold fast to the Lord your God, as you have until now. He warned them about the dangers of mixing with the pagan nations and adopting their practices. He reminded them that just as every good promise from God had been fulfilled, so would every warning come true if they turned away from him. Later, Joshua gathered the people again at Shechem for another assembly. This time, he reviewed Israel's entire history, from Abraham's call to their current settlement in Canaan. Then he issued his famous challenge. Joshua 24, verse 14 and 15 record his words. Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve. Joshua put the decision squarely before them. He wasn't forcing them, wasn't manipulating them. He was calling them to make a conscious choice. And then he declared his own choice. As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. The people responded enthusiastically, pledging their loyalty to the Lord. Joshua warned them that serving God was serious and that God was holy and jealous. But they insisted, so Joshua made a covenant with the people that day at Shechem. Joshua 24 verses 26 and 27 describe what he did. And Joshua recorded these things in the book of the law of God. Then he took a large stone and set it up there under the oak near the holy place of the Lord. "See," he said to all the people, "this stone will be a witness against us. It has heard all the words the Lord has said to us. It will be a witness against you if you are untrue to your God." Then Joshua sent everyone home to their inheritances. Shortly after, his life ended. Joshua 24 verses 29 and 30 record his death. After these things, Joshua son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. And they buried him in the land of his inheritance at Timnath-Serah, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. Joshua died at 110 years old. He had been Moses' aide, had stood with Caleb against the nation's fear, had waited 40 years in the wilderness, had led Israel across the Jordan, had conquered the land, and had seen God fulfill every promise. He was buried in his own town, in the land God had given him. The Bible adds one more important detail. Joshua 24 verse 31 says, "Israel served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had experienced everything the Lord had done for Israel. As long as the generation that saw God's mighty works remained alive, Israel stayed faithful." Caleb's death isn't recorded in Scripture with the same detail, but he had received his inheritance at Hebron and had lived to see his descendants established in the land of the giants. Two men who had believed when everyone else doubted, who had waited when everyone else died, who had entered when everyone else was buried in the wilderness. Their story was complete. If this story strengthened your faith and reminded you that God keeps his promises, subscribe to this channel so you never miss another powerful biblical story that can transform your perspective. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that waiting on God is never wasted, that faith always outlasts fear, and that what God promises, he delivers, no matter how long it takes. Hit that like button if Joshua and Caleb's courage inspired you to trust God more deeply. Your share might be exactly what someone needs to hold on to their promise for one more day.